Okay, so we are live, at least I guess so. So today we are streaming to LinkedIn, to YouTube, to Twitter, and yeah, hopefully we'll have more participants joining soon. So, well, you can see that on YouTube we are basically watched by exactly 0 people. So it means that I haven't connected, but on LinkedIn we actually have 10 people by now, so it's nice. I think we still can have a few minutes for the warm-up before we go with the main discussion. So today's webinar, we are talking about WireMock 3, its upcoming release of WireMock Java, or just WireMock as we call it. So it's a mainstream implementation that includes most of WireMock capabilities, and the one which is being used in WireMock Docker and many other integrations. So if you use WireMock, most likely you're using either WireMock 2 or WireMock 3, for example, if you're running with WireMock Cloud at the moment. Today with us, we have Tom Akehurst, who is a creator of WireMock and also a co-founder of WireMock Inc. So, Tom, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Tom Akehurst. I started the WireMock open source project back in 2011. Brief origin story. I was working at the time for Disney Parks and Resorts, and it was a big sort of, not exactly microservices because people weren't calling it that then, but it was a big kind of SOA project involving lots of REST APIs, and we were building a system that was consuming all of these and not making lots of progress because things were broken, things were not delivered yet, things didn't quite conform to spec and so on like that. So I went on paternity leave and kind of decided I had this sort of itch to scratch and started building a tool that would allow me to kind of take essentially take this, as it was at the time, like sort of wiki specifications for APIs and turn them into mocks so that we could test our application against those instead of waiting for people to ship APIs. And then sort of after that, it just became this thing that I can continue contributing to in my spare time, and it slowly kind of gathered a bit of a following, and people used it and started contributing to it. Then things took off a little bit more sort of in 2014 when microservices started being talked about a lot. People realized they needed a tool like this to do this kind of testing when suddenly they had lots more sort of network components in their architecture. Then sort of more recently, I got involved in starting WireMock the business. So launched a commercial SaaS, cloud product on top of that. I guess the rest is history.
So thanks a lot for the introduction. So yeah, WireMock started many years ago, and first time I saw WireMock, I believe it was 2013 or 2014. So shortly after I started contributing to the Jenkins project. And actually, for our environment, we had a lot of dependencies on REST APIs, and WireMock was the tool that we started using for some of the plugins. And now it's quite popular among Jenkins infrastructure. So this is how I got introduced to it. And for me, I've been using it ever since at many projects. So thanks a lot, Tom, for creating it. Yeah, for today, so for this session, the idea is to have a kind of ask me anything format. So if you're watching us live, just drop the questions to the chat on LinkedIn, YouTube, or on Slack. I will be bringing up questions. So if you want to ask Tom about anything, just do that. Key discussion for today is where WireMock is going, what is WireMock 3, what's inside, and actually what new features you would get as users. And we don't have slides. We will be doing screen sharing and showing things during the discussion. But the whole idea is to keep it as much informal as possible and to provide as much opportunities for you to ask questions as possible too. So if you want to ask something, just do so. And we are around to answer all questions. So I think we can begin with the main part. And for me, it would be interesting to discuss, okay, what is the current state of WireMock and how is it doing from your perspective?
Yeah, okay. So WireMock spent a very long time on the sort of the 2.x version, and grew and changed a lot in terms of functionality on the 2.x version. But the sort of, I guess, the major sort of inflection point that we hit a little while ago was that Jetty, which is the web server library that WireMock uses, stopped supporting Java 8. So we needed to move with the times, particularly because things like automated security scanning have become a lot more commonplace these days. Particularly with kind of components like web servers, you really need to kind of move with the times and stay on the latest versions. Otherwise, anybody who's got any kind of security scanning tools in their pipeline will start seeing red flags all over the place. So we decided this was, the motivation to go from 2.x to 3.x, and to say that the move to version 3 was was going to enable us to go up to the new major Java version, so Java 11, and the latest Jetty version, so Jetty 11, and in practice, sort of keep pace with a few of the other dependencies that we have in the mix as well. So that was a major thing, and it's been a little while now, but we like with 2.x, we've been shipping a series of betas for 3.x before sort of coming out of beta. So we I'm not actually sure how long ago it was we shipped the first 3.x beta. It was probably 5 or 6 months ago, something like that, if I remember rightly. But there's been a series of betas, and first of all, like I say, we've upgraded the minimum version of Java, Jetty, other dependencies, all that kind of stuff. A few other things have gone in as well. So there's a few new interesting things around kind of request matching that weren't in 2.x. So you can now match on JSON schema for request bodies is a big one. You can now match on path templates, so the kind of URI template syntax is used in Open API and so on like that. You can now use directly when matching URL paths. You can. This is something that's people have been asking about for literally years, and we've finally got around to doing it. Is being able to match on form parameters in the same way as you can on query parameters. So if you've got form encoded post bodies, then you can match on the individual components rather than having to do kind of ugly stuff with contains or regex matches or whatever. And then finally, there's arguably a fairly obvious one, but the addition of a logical not, so you can invert the meaning of any of the other matches in there, which can be quite handy. So there's a load of new stuff in there, and then I guess the sort of third area that's sort of worth focusing on for a while is we've also made some sort of major architecture changes that are really about sort of kind of enabling more flexibility in future, and enabling us to do make possible or make more easy, I suppose, sort of support for new protocols, new ways of doing things, and so on like that. So in particular, and I'm literally tonight hopefully going to be pushing out the first beta, which has got a lot of these changes in. but there's been a big reworking of the extension system. So a sort of V2 version of all of the major extension interfaces, which kind of gives you a few new things. That gives you more context in the in terms of the information you're given when the interfaces are called. So that's one thing. There's sort of a kind of factory pattern for instantiating extensions, which means you can kind of use this for dependency injection of core Java services into extensions. So you get more access to the internals of WireMock. Things like the admin interface, the file source, the stores interface, which I'll get onto in a moment. So there's all of that stuff as well. So you can kind of better access things that are already there. It makes use of the Java service loader now. So if you're doing standalone, you won't have to kind of explicitly list all of the extension class names as you did before. So that should make life easier, sort of in a Docker and standalone context and so on like that. If you want to load extensions with the your server runner. And then finally, there's a couple more extension points that didn't exist before. So one is one that allows you to provide template helpers into the template engine. So you can customize that further. And then the other one is one that allows you to provide extra model elements into the template engine. So you can inject data from data sources that you want to plug in, or you can synthesize data in some way that doesn't otherwise exist. And finally, and this is kind of slightly outside of the extensions mechanism, but there's also now this new abstraction in there, which is just called stores. And essentially, this is a sort of pluggable state backend for all of WireMock. So traditionally, WireMock has been sort of mostly memory based and somewhat sort of file based in terms of how it stores and retrieves data. And periodically people have asked about, can I plug in MongoDB or DynamoDB or my relational database or Redis or, whatever my favorite sort of backend provider is. And there hasn't really been a good way of doing this without really having to hack up the fork and hack up the WireMock core. So now there's this abstraction called stores. And essentially this is a set of interfaces for different kind of store models for different aspects of WireMock's core. And the default implementation kind of replaces it behaves exactly as WireMock always did. So mostly memory and, to some extent on the file system. But what you can do is you can provide your own implementation of this. And you can, integrate it with whatever kind of storage system you want. And like I say, also this stores abstraction is itself a kind of core service. So, regardless of kind of whatever implementation WireMock is running, you can inject the interface into your extensions, and then if you need to store and retrieve data within your extensions, for instance, then you can do so in a way that's kind of agnostic to the specific implementation being used, rather than what you would have ended up doing previously, which probably would have meant using a concrete storage implementation and reading and writing files or reading and writing stuff turned from memory, and thus not getting that kind of portability. So I guess it's probably worth stating this is kind of a general architectural principle we're building towards, is this trying to make it so you can build extensions in a way which are portable across different kind of deployment scenarios. So if you're regardless of how you're storing data and ultimately, maybe the platform you're running on, whether it's sort of Android or in a Lambda or in a traditional JVM, making the extension architecture kind of as invariant as possible to that stuff, so you don't find that your extensions coupled to one particular platform when you run.
Yeah, which is super helpful. We already have quite a lot of deployments. So since WireMock Docker was introduced, WireMock has been adopted in so many different environments. We've already seen a lot of different hacks, for example, attaching external storage through Logstash, also some scalability and observability features through existing extension mechanism, and then a lot of reflection. So hopefully with the new extension engine, it will become much more simple to implement.
Sorry, this is a good point. There's one additional very important aspect of the new extension engine that I didn't mention, which is seems like a small feature, but I think actually is quite significant in terms of the way we do a number of things, and that's the ability to kind of attach sort of arbitrary sub events onto kind of there's this for a while there's existed this kind of serve event concept within WireMock, which sort of gets built at the beginning of request processing and kind of collects information as the request is processed. So you start off with just the request information, and then after matching, we attach the stub that's been matched or not if there isn't one, and then we generate the response, and then the response gets attached, and then finally we send the response back to the client, and we collect a load of timing information. So this has been there for a while, but what we now support as well is the ability to attach your own data to that. And WireMock itself is using that in a few places. So, for instance, that diff report that you get when you get a non-match, that will now also be attached as a sub event onto the main serve event. And there's a couple of sort of key benefits to this. Because these sub events are returned in sort of queried request log data, this means that you can get at this information via WireMock's API. So it means you can interact with it programmatically. You can do your own validations programmatically to say, did something happen or not happen, as part of this, part of this, request processing flow. It means that if you're running a remote WireMock server, and actually this is true of, WireMock Cloud as well, our commercial product, if you're, obviously we don't allow customers to get at our internal log files, but there's a whole load of stuff that we really want to be able to expose to you, while you're working with your own mock APIs. So part of the benefit of this is if all you've got access to is the APIs of the running WireMock instance, it exposes all this detailed information about, things that, usually things that went wrong during the request processing flow. So if there are errors parsing JSON documents, for instance, or the request didn't match, or maybe if you've written an extension, which is like a custom validator of some kind, then you can attach the validation information as these sub events. And that means they just get presented out as part of the request log. So it provides this nice unified way to sort of, capture all this information about what happened during the processing of a request in one place. And finally, this also means that another thing that gets complained about a lot is WireMock's logging, and it's kind of inconsistent, and it's not very flexible, and doesn't always expose the information that you're really interested in. And what we're now in a position to do, and I think this will probably come shortly after we've gone out of beta, is we will add a new logger that is essentially just a request listener for these serve events. And we'll just provide a number of different renderings of the serve event in detail. So you get the request, the response, the match stub, all the sub events, everything all sort of collected together in one big event. So, very, very rich level of detail in there. And actually, we can logging is only part of observability these days, right? And this new event listener extension point that we can now exploit, combined with these sub events, provides this sort of rich basis for doing all sorts of other observability stuff. So we can plug in whatever telemetry we like, and essentially just pull information straight from this event data and send it out to our monitoring stroke observability system of choice.
Yeah. So for WireMock 2, there is a Prometheus extension. So with WireMock 3, with all these capabilities, I guess it will be much easier to integrate with all such observability tools, right?
Yeah. I think this will make it a lot easier, and just the richness of the information that can be made available will go up significantly as well. So this is all good for people wanting to kind of stitch WireMock into their own environments with their own tools for doing these things.
This is really good. And yeah, thanks a lot. So just to summarize the key features for WireMock 3. So yes, this is extensibility. So also better event logging and sub-events for all kinds of traceability and observability purposes. Then again, we drop Java 8 support and adopt modern versions of Jetty, etc. And also a bunch of features, as you mentioned in the beginning, right? So these are key items that we learned in WireMock 3. What I wanted to show to the audience that actually, if you're interested to know more what is there, you can just go to our GitHub, because there we actually have a GitHub project that summarizes key activities. And what we presented today is just, well, it's basically a tip of the iceberg in terms of minor features being landed, etc. Because there is a lot of contributions that have been already integrated towards WireMock 3, and which is waiting for the general availability release, and even more will happen in the future. For the top level things, yes, we have a GitHub project. So here you can see what we actually did so far, what is actually in development, and what is about being landed. And there is also some items that we prioritized for finalizing for this release. And there are some changes that are worth discussing. So for example, I believe that the next beta release will be actually using another group ID. Is it correct?
Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah, so important to say this is not we're not changing the Java packages yet, at least in this, but this is just the Maven group ID. So we already have some other peripheral stuff on the org.wiremock group ID, and we'll be shifting the core asset over to that. Hopefully that will make it slightly, so at the moment we have this slight weird discontinuity where originally WireMock 2.x, so we did actually drop Java 7 support sort of within the 2.x line. And the way we handled it for various reasons was to change the artifact ID and put JRE8, so we ended up with a plain one without JRE8 in there, which stopped at a certain point when we stopped Java 7 support. And then the JRE8 one was the one that sort of continued. But sort of restoring the sort of non-JRE8 artifact ID then means you've got this sort of versions up to a certain point, stopping with this, mid 2 version where Java 7 stopped, and then a big jump, and then it's continuing for 3, which is already confusing people who started using the beta version. So by changing the group ID as well, it just sort of makes it clear that we are, this is sort of a new major version and a new line of artifacts, and I'm hoping we'll clarify things a bit. I'm half expecting to be proved horribly wrong, when the rubber hits the road with that, but we'll see anyway. And certainly, I think having a Maven group ID that matches our domain name after all these years also seems like good practice.
Yeah, definitely. And on the roadmap, there are also a few stories related to new protocols. So, for example, I see that GraphQL is in progress, and there is also gRPC support. Could you please tell us more about how you see it?
Yeah, so I suppose part of the motivation for this extension re-architecture is about making these things easier. And in fact, there's another aspect of the extension architecture I neglected, which is harmonizing the way custom matches work in terms of their JSON syntax with core matches. So at the moment, custom matches have got this slightly clunky syntax where you say, custom matcher, and then the details inside of it. And what would be nice is if you can plug in, extra match types and just refer to them by name in the same way as you do with the core. So once we've done this, this means that certainly, this opens up the possibility of writing a GraphQL matcher, and just kind of having that as an extension. And when you add it, you just got another match type that matches GraphQL requests. So that's what we're aiming for there. So we're hoping to get an extension out, and with this nice new extension loading approach, you should just be able to drop the jar file into the extensions folder in the in Docker or in standalone, and it will kind of just work rather than having to fiddle around painfully with class names like you do at the moment. So that's number one. And gRPC is a slightly more interesting one. Up until quite recently, I was thinking that we would need to sort of have to swap out more bits of WireMock's kind of core plumbing in order to support that. The reason being that the sort of main Java gRPC implementation, the main Google one, doesn't. Yeah, it's based on its own like Netty based web server implementation, and the reason for that was until fairly recently the servlet API didn't support the HTTP2 features needed to to do everything that gRPC used. So the model I originally had is that so there is already a web server abstraction, a swappable one within WireMock. So potentially sort of exploiting that as a way of doing a gRPC server. But I have just noticed that the main gRPC Java project seem to have now added support for Servlet 4.0. Now that we've moved up to Jessie 11, we should be able to, with any luck, support. So I'm hopeful actually that we can also build a gRPC extension that just kind of works in the same way as the one we're planning for GraphQL. But if not, we still have this fallback of using the web server factory hook within WireMock to plug in the kind of Netty based gRPC server. I'm hoping it won't come to that because I think that will complicate things quite a bit. But either way, one of these two strategies will work, I'm sure, and so then we will, we'll be able to bring on board, like I say, sort of gRPC and GraphQL as in addition to the current protocols we support.
Yeah, thanks for the summary. So yeah, for gRPC, it was mentioning that there is already one implementation that you could try out. So there is a standalone container image that basically maps the requests from gRPC to HTTP REST API so that you get all the features of WireMock. At the same time, there are certain limitations for such approach. So, for example, you cannot do gRPC specific matching. There is a lot of limitations. You also have to run a standalone container with all the capabilities. So, of course, when we talk about WireMock extension, I think that it's something that would be the better approach going forward for WireMock. And so going back to our roadmap, there is actually quite a lot of other features that are scheduled. There is definitely a lot of things that should simplify usage, like just improving API, improving quality of life. Thanks a lot to so many contributors who submitted patches already. So we've integrated maybe 24 pull requests already for various API enhancements since 3.0 beta started, and I believe that there will be even more in the future that we need to integrate. So if you're interested to improve some APIs, etc., it's definitely a good time.
Yeah, it's definitely worth mentioning all the work that's gone into kind of modernizing the code base, particularly around use of kind of data structures and functional code. So, traditionally WireMock has used Guava very heavily for, primarily kind of, sort of functional type styles of coding. But, it started using that kind of well prior to Java 8 coming out and lambdas and streams. So there's been a load of great work from a handful of contributors to migrate us away from sort of Guava for that kind of thing and onto more modern lambdas and streams approaches. And likewise, there's a load of other stuff that Guava provides that is now kind of well catered for, particularly in Java 11. So we're sort of slowly moving away from that, and hopefully with a view to completely getting rid of Guava as a dependency, which would be nice from the point of view of shrinking the standalone jar size, also nice from the point of view of not pulling it in as a transitive dependency and the complications in people's dependency management that brings. I know it being a Google library, they like to regularly bump the major version and break everything. So it's not always the easiest library to live with when you've got several different other libraries bringing different versions of it in.
Yeah, definitely. Especially if you talk about native images. So now there is a lot of experiments about running WireMock on GraalVM. There is a Quarkus extension that works actually quite well. And when you have a lot of dependencies, especially bulky ones like Guava, which are known to not always work well for native images, it actually creates additional obstacles. So by making things lightweight, I think that we open a lot more opportunities for better images and for better implementations in the future.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, the Android community struggled with the method counts that were largely due to Guava being there. So yeah, if we can eventually remove it, then that would be helpful to anybody wanting to kind of revive the Android port.
Yeah, well, maybe even an Android mobile app, which would be quite handy for some use cases. But yeah, so thanks a lot for the summary of the release. And yeah, one important thing that actually comes up quite often, and I already got a question on LinkedIn. So how do you actually see a future evolution of WireMock? Which key features you would like to see, and how do you see the architecture of this release of the project going forward?
Sorry, this is a question for me or the audience, is it?
Yes, this is a question from the audience.
Question from the audience. Okay. So yeah, so there's a load of stuff that I suppose I didn't mention in the context of going from. Most of what I've talked about is kind of the things we're intending to come out of 3.0 beta with. There's a few other things that I think we can add after that sort of don't constitute like architectural or breaking changes, and so we don't need to do pre-beta. I mean, there's stuff like there's people have been asking about a secrets provider recently, so that you can use things in templating bring secrets into templating. There's better support for MTLS, so more people are using WireMock in contexts, like inside Kubernetes clusters and so on, and client certificates and MTLS seems to be sort of picking up in popularity as an authentication method. So we need to support that better. I've got a big sort of slightly amorphous chunk of work in my head around the recorder and how that works. So I think we can make recording a much smarter, the logic around that a lot smarter, and make it easier to record, particularly recording incrementally. So the one thing the recorder is not so good at the moment is if you have an API which is evolving and you kind of want to keep doing subsequent recordings and sort of for your mock to evolve intelligently, and particularly if you've recorded and then you've made hand edits afterwards, to sort of be able to to have those two things kind of cohabit nicely. That's something that's not so easy to do at the moment. You still have to do quite a bit of work in order to to essentially kind of do that merging yourself. So I think there's a load of stuff we can do to make that a lot easier. Likewise, the work, the interaction between recording and forward proxying as well, I think could be made a lot easier, and particularly in use cases like with mobile use cases, actually, right? So if you've got an Android app and it's got maybe several backends it's talking to at the same time, it's kind of it's a lot more painful with a mobile app than it is with, say, a microservice to go and swap all the base URLs out. So using proxying becomes an attractive option, but at the moment the recording like that is kind of painful. So I think there's definitely sort of big improvements we can make in the recorder logic. I suppose the other thing about the recorder logic as well is it's essentially what recording really is a mapping function between an example request and a stub, or a collection of stubs or whatever. And we've kind of been doing this in a piecemeal basis in WireMock Cloud, actually. So the import logic sort of works this way. It's essentially kind of like munging external formats into the recorder's format and then feeding them through the recorder pipeline. But I think we want to make that a sort of more architecturally explicit, so the recorder really becomes a generic, feed me examples of what, in the format that I recognize, and you'll get a mock API out the other end. And then whether your examples are, the recorder itself, or a half file, or a Postman collection, or whatever, whatever request response format you're working with, you can kind of feed it into this pipeline and get something sensible out the other end. So I think that's a sort of major bit of work on the horizon.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And for synchronous APIs, do you see something happening?
Yeah. So I mean, that's the kind of the big scary
Yeah.
one, I suppose. I've been thinking about this on and off for a couple of years now, sort of how we might do this. And I think there's probably a way to do this that's still kind of like the consistent with the WireMock way, and essentially kind of introducing a slightly more generalized sort of version of the stub model that we have at the moment. So being able to specify trigger events and mapping them onto kind of resulting actions. So it's kind of like a stub, but where a stub is a sort of a one-to-one request in, response out. To sort of define a slightly more generalized version of that. So like I get an event in, and that event could be an HTTP call, or it could be a WebSocket message, or it could be a Kafka message, or, via something plugged in via a provider interface, sort of JMS, if you're really feeling masochistic. And then have the ability to kind of map that onto outputs. So it might be that you make an HTTP call on the way in, but then it emits a Kafka message on the way out, something like that. And I think we can do that, but then still build this on the foundation of WireMock's matches for matching messages, and then WireMock's templating system for producing dynamic results, and all of the other kind of bits of infrastructure that WireMock kind of brings to that provides into that kind of problem space, and also the extension mechanism as well. So being able to do get that same extensibility for asynchronous stuff that we do for synchronous stuff.
Yeah, it would be super helpful. Of course, when we talk about new protocols, and especially async protocols, there would be some additional matchers and also some additional response behaviors, because right now you can set false, you can set delays, but maybe there will be even more use cases for stateful behavior already supported in WireMock. This is actually the feature that has been always useful for me when you work with a legacy interface. Just record the things, reverse engineer them a bit, and replay. And for async, if you get some timings, etc., I think that will become super helpful for integration testing purposes.
Yeah, that's where it gets really fun, right? Is establishing causality when all you've got is messages flying around everywhere. The nice thing about HTTP is that cause and effect are completely straightforward. Request in and response out. Whereas you have messages pinging around the place, particularly where they're like you say, where there's appreciable delays in them. It can be quite difficult to establish that this event was emitted as a result of this being emitted versus just some spontaneous event that happened somewhere else. So yeah, I think definitely the sort of record and playback story within async is where the real fun lies, let's say.
Definitely. And there is another interesting story which happens not exactly within WireMock Core, but rather with wide ecosystem. So there have been always a lot of implementations of WireMock for different technology stacks and languages, for example, for Python, .NET, Rust, and many other implementations. And now we see that there is a lot of discussions, and there are already a few implementations for Testcontainers models, which actually take WireMock Docker, the official image we have. That includes WireMock, now WireMock 2, soon WireMock 3. And basically, how do you see that evolving, and what's the fuss around there? Yeah, I guess it was asked by user named Oleg somewhere on the chat. So what's your perception about this evolution, and actually how you see a large evolution of WireMock as a distributable?
Kind of an open question, isn't it? I mean, I think we, the sort of, I suppose the landscape is changing quite quickly and in quite interesting ways at the moment, isn't it? I mean, obviously the last few years, shift to containerize everything and run things in orchestrators, and in particular Kubernetes, I think has changed people's expectations of how these things should work. And we're keen to keep up with that and make sure that you can take WireMock to the places that you need to run it in. I think the work we're starting to do with Testcontainers is a great start there. Obviously they've got lots of traction at the moment, and they've made the job of working with Docker from a developer workflow standpoint so much easier that it's kind of a no-brainer to sort of jump on board with that. But yeah, I think beyond that, there's a lot of options. And again, going back to the things we were saying before, I think part of the purpose of the re-architecture we're doing in version 3, and in particular the sort of flexibility around the sort of size and shape of the thing we're deploying. A lot of that is about opening up new options for deployment. So, like I say, if you can chop particular libraries in and out, so like I say, for argument's sake, you can remove Jetty and you can remove the Apache client and swap for something which perhaps a different platform like Android or like a function as a service platform provides. Then you make it that much easier to deploy WireMock into those contexts rather than kind of jamming in sort of JDK friendly, but maybe not so friendly to those platforms kind of libraries in there. So I think in the short term, that's what we're doing to kind of enable that extra portability. But yeah, longer term, I think we just need to keep an eye on the needs of these platforms. Obviously, also our commercial product, WireMock Cloud, is going to be coming to Kubernetes shortly. That's the other big thing we're doing in terms of platform modernization. So you'll be able to deploy the full team-based UI, plus management system version of WireMock Cloud as exists in the cloud at the moment onto your Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And now, you mentioned WireMock Cloud quite a lot. Basically, right now it's a SaaS product, right? So what are the key capabilities of it from your point of view?
So it's really the place you go when you want to scale up from just using WireMock in a kind of in a single developer or sort of narrow integration test kind of context. So it solves a bunch of problems. It gives you somewhere easy to go and host your mocks kind of out on the internet, so it does all the routine stuff like DNS and DLS support and just kind of management of persistence and configuration and all that kind of thing that you need from all of that. It gives you a nice UI that you can go and tinker with things within, and gives you that layer of just kind of team collaboration and security and all that kind of stuff that you expect to have from a product that's meant to support teams rather than kind of individuals. So it saves you doing a lot of the engineering you would otherwise do yourself in order to kind of layer those collaboration features over the open source product. It does a few things the open source product doesn't. So like I say, the sort of support for particularly Open API, also some other external formats is in the cloud version only at the moment. And the thing we're actively working on is this kind of round trip engineering around Open API. So the ability to both start by kind of prototyping an API by building mocks and having it generate Open API, and also in fact generating a developer portal page or set of pages for your APIs kind of on the fly as you're mocking them, which is really nice. And then we already have the ability to kind of import an Open API, so you can generate a mock API from that as well. And shortly there'll be kind of a runtime validator as well, so you can kind of detect at runtime sort of drift between the two of these things. And really what that's intended to enable is this kind of end-to-end workflow, for sort of, prototyping, doing development and test with, and then kind of publishing and doing developer enablement around the mock APIs that you're working with. So if you're in the situation where you've got sort of a producing team and one or more consuming teams, for instance, maybe in a sort of microservices environment, then rather than kind of going and whiteboarding something and then the producing team kind of building a building a real implementation. The consuming team's kind of sitting on their hands until this is arrived. You can go and kind of collaboratively prototype a mock API together, and then consuming teams have got a mock to work against right away, and they've got this nice developer portal page they can use to refer to as documentation. But then meanwhile, the producing team have got a reference implementation they can use, and you reduce the problems of the two halves of the bridge not meeting in the middle, and you kind of shift left a lot of the sort of client build activities that you'd otherwise have to do kind of after the server build has happened.
Yeah, that's pretty handy. And WireMock Cloud was also used to generate one of the features we announced in May. So maybe you haven't seen it yet. So it's API templates library. So basically, this is a repository of a lot of open templates. There are something like more than 2,000 various APIs and services, and for all of them, some initial mocking API is generated. So if you need to start quickly with these services with WireMock or with WireMock Cloud, you can use this repository. And as I mentioned before during the meetup last week, actually it's a good time to contribute. So if you use some open services, if you need to do some mocking, we actually invite you to contribute to this repository so that everyone could reuse this code base and also work together on making the mocks more handy. So for example, there is even mocking for WireMock admin API. So it's basically one of the mocks we use for integration tests. And I think that we could create more and more such tools that are useful for development purposes. So this is basically...
It's worth pointing out, actually, this library is also available sort of from within WireMock Cloud. So you can just kind of new up an API from a template rather than a blank one. And actually, the other thing that Cloud gives you is the ability to define an organizational catalog as well. So if you're, as you're developing mocks of, for instance, your own microservices, you can add them into the template library for your organization, and then your colleagues, other teams in your organization can, spawn their own copies of those mocks and, run their own copies, and thus, hack the data around, do whatever they like with them without kind of, interfering with, what's happening with other teams.
Okay, thank you. There is another question we got. By the way, if you want to ask questions, just drop them in the chat, and we still have a few minutes to answer them. So the question is, when WireMock 3 is actually going to be shipped?
Hopefully very soon. Like I say, I'm going to put another beta out, hopefully this evening, which is going to have this upgrade to the extensions interfaces and the addition of sub events. So that's quite a big milestone, and I'm hoping that will be maybe the final beta, or there may be one more on top of that, depending on if we get any feedback that's sort of worth trialing. But ideally, I'd like to get out of beta in the next couple of weeks. I think we've been in beta for quite a long time, and quite a lot of stuff has gone into it now. So I feel like this is kind of the last glut of major changes that we want to make now, and then really the remainder is just going to be kind of tweaks and refinements on what we put in there, and then the other major things we talked about, I think they can come after the 3.0 release. Yeah,
I think that so with new extension API and other implementations, a lot of new features could be integrated in a compatible way. And if some require additional compatibility breaking changes, I think that for WireMock 4 we can actually do the new release maybe in a few months. Why not? So in this case, even major versions are quite cheap, so we could definitely pull more things in the next release and actually improve the velocity quite a bit.
Yeah. And like we say, also hopefully more could be achieved via extension points and and extension libraries rather than via changing things in the core going forward as well. This is the hope anyway. I mean, inevitably when you do things like dropping Java, major Java versions, you have to go up a major version of WireMock. But a lot of the motivation in this case beyond dropping Java 8 was about this making quite significant changes to the architecture that sort of don't feel like the right thing to do within a single major version. But yeah, hopefully this will expand significantly the scope of things we can do without having to make those big changes.
Yeah, definitely. Another question. So will WireMock 3 support Java 21?
Yes. I have to admit I haven't given that a lot of thought. I mean, to the extent that you can run things, built with older versions of Java with newer versions of Java, it should already work.
I guess. I think, the thing with Java 21 release is that it's going to be officially released only in September. And for example, when we were working on Java 11 release feels like eternity ago. At that point I was in the Jenkins community, and we had a goal to release Java 11 support on the day of announcement. And basically, what it took, even for alpha beta releases and release candidates, there were some changes rolling in. So until the very last moment, nobody knew what would be included in that release, what would require the changes. So for me personally, I wouldn't commit on anything until the release is shipped. And
that sounds sensible. And I have to admit I haven't personally given it a lot of thought, but I think that's probably. I don't think we've got a particularly strong reason to kind of be out with it on the day of the release. I don't think. I think that maintaining support for older but still in support versions of Java is more important than being right at the bleeding edge all the time with a tool like WireMock. Certainly, my experience is that's the end of things that people tend to complain more, rather than sort of the bleeding edge versions. But that said, as soon as 21 is in GA, then we ought to make sure we're playing nicely with it.
Yeah, what is worth mentioning that if you use WireMock Docker, for example, in Testcontainers, in other frameworks like WireMock Python or WireMock Captain for JavaScript, so these frameworks basically use WireMock Docker. And in this case, you don't have to care which version of Java it actually runs on, because everything is isolated. So, for example, when 21 is out, you can use Testcontainers model for Java to do some initial tests, even if WireMock doesn't work. But I think that we will be putting some tests when the release candidate is out.
Yeah, it'll go into the build matrix in the not too distant future.
Yeah, definitely. So we don't have other questions in the chat right now, but I always have one question. So if I want to contribute, or if somebody wants to contribute, what from your point of view would be a priorities right now, and actually how to get started with the initiatives around WireMock?
So I think we're getting a bit better about adding help wanted stickers on the issues that we want help with. We're going to continue to do that, and mark things up as being where help is wanted. I think there are issues both big and small that bug fixes, small enhancements, all the way up to kind of entire major feature areas that we would like help with. And in terms of specific stuff, I mean, I think some of the stuff I've talked about that we've not done yet. So the writing a new logger, some integrations that exploit better the new event system for observability purposes. I mean, if we find particularly people with experience of working with GraphQL and gRPC who wanted to kind of tackle those extension points, then that would be amazing. I think we're sort of now in a position where we can support those and support them nicely, without hacking things up too much. So it would be great to get contributions for that kind of thing. But yeah, otherwise I think a fairly typical open source answer, right? If there's a bug that you see that's labeled as help wanted, or even if not, but you kind of think, I could fix that, then please dive in, fork the repository, create a pull request, standard stuff. We have a load of Oleg has now written a load of great contributor guidelines, and it's much easier to get acquainted with the project now and figure out what you sort of should or shouldn't be doing in the context of a change. I think so. I think dive in and create a pull request and follow the guidelines. I think and if you find something that's an enhancement, an issue that's an enhancement request, where you've got an idea for something, then at a high level, the process is to sort of discuss it in an issue, figure out if this is something we want to do, and if and sort of talk a bit about design and so on like that, and then again dive in, raise a pull request per the guidelines, and submit it back. And obviously we also we always welcome contributions to documentation and that kind of thing. Also things like sort of external tutorials, videos, any kind of content really that teaches people how to use WireMock features sort of in more depth than the current documentation does. All of that is very welcome as a contribution as well.
Yeah, if you're interested, if you join the Slack channel, there is help contributing, where you can find a lot of information. And from the user standpoint, one thing, as Tom mentioned, there is help wanted, the good first issue labels in WireMock and in all other repositories in GitHub org. Also, one way to actually understand what's going on and where the contributions would be needed is looking at the roadmap, because there are some items here. So, for example, for WireMock 3, which we were discussing today, there is a number of stories in progress that would definitely benefit from some contributions, like maybe some coding, feedback, reviews, design. Same for must-have, for considered. There is a lot of things here. Some items actually include even contributing guidelines. And for wider scope, there is also a public roadmap. It's still in drafts. I believe that I will be announcing it maybe next week, but it's the attempt to capture all the key initiatives within WireMock organization. So there is multiple implementations, multiple projects, and you can find key initiatives there from the WireMock community standpoint. And for example, if you're interested in Python, if you're interested in Golang and documentation, you can definitely find something. So for example, I've just released model for Testcontainers Golang, I believe 2 days ago. So there is a lot of contributions needed there if you're into Golang programming. And for Java, we have infinite opportunities. So for example, we mentioned the Java 21 support. So probably it's a good time to contribute, to do some integration tests. And if you're interested, you can definitely find a lot of examples here. Oh, I actually wasn't sharing my screen, right? Oops. Hey, it happens, but there is a contributing guide. So you can find all the links here. I will probably just provide a few pointers. Yeah, that happens all the time with StreamYard, because you need to click 3 buttons. And I usually assume that after I shared my screen, it's actually being shared. So here, what I was presenting, so there is WireMock org.participate, where you can find a lot of information. Then, in addition to that, there is contributing guide, which covers a lot of different types of contributions. So, for example, here, it doesn't even work today. Okay. So you can find guidelines for all kinds of typical contributions, including documentation, as Tom mentioned, reviews, advocacy, documentation, and just join the chat. And for all the tickets, you can discuss them on the roadmap, and you can discover them just on the issue list. We're using standard GitHub filters like help wanted, good first issue, so you can actually find a lot of information here. Okay, this is what I wanted to show. I'm sorry for the GraphQL with the screen sharing. So we don't have more questions at the moment. So Tom, would you like to send a few words before we close down?
This is the bit I haven't thought through at all. So yeah, I don't really have any closing words. I think I've covered most of most of what I want to talk about. Yeah, I mean, I think we are really pushing very hard at the moment to make the WireMock open source projects sort of a broader and more sort of user friendly and welcoming space. We're I think when it was just sort of me running the show alone, WireMock open source wasn't the easiest project to inhabit, and I think that was a bit of a deterrent to contributing. But we're and when I say we, mostly Oleg is working very hard to to improve things on that front. So we more than ever we welcome contributions from the community and also suggestions on how we can make it even easier to participate and to to contribute and make improvements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thanks to all people who actually contribute a lot of code these days and help us to improve WireMock Core, all the packaging, distributions, and actually expand the ecosystem to many other technology stacks. So like Spring Boot, Quarkus, etc., etc. There are so many implementations that are helpful, that improve developer experience, and hopefully we will see even more of them in the future. Mm-hmm. So thanks everyone for your time. And yeah, thanks a lot, Tom, for joining us and for providing heads up about what's inside WireMock 3.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Oleg. Thanks everyone else for listening.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.